All right. Welcome, everybody. I think it's time to start. So very glad that all of you have joined us, and I'm very glad to um, have a chance to speak to you along with my colleagues on this very important topic, the 10 reason cycle to hate. Just a bit of a background about where this comes from. Um, My name is Vijendra Rao. I'm a lead economist in the Development Research Group. We have here on the podium Hazel Marcus, who is Davis Brack Professor in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. And at the risk of embarrassing her, but I've known her a long time, one of the world's great social psychologists. Prerna Singh, who is a Mahatma Gandhi Professor, Associate Professor of Political Science at Brown, and another wonderful scholar. The three of us belong to something called the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, right? That's my non-paying gig outside the bank. Important to say that. And what we do, what CFAR does for short, is to bring scholars from different disciplines together to study one topic at a time. Yeah? And we hang together sometimes for years. I mean, I've been in CFAR for 20 years. We've been working on this as a group for about 5 years now, on this particular topic for about 2 years. So what that interdisciplinary interaction does is it creates synergies that one discipline couldn't do, a lesson that the bank would do well from learning. My department, Development Research Group, has one sociologist, Michael Woolcock, who is with us, who leads social scientists, and Michael and I joined more or less the same time at the bank in 98, 99. But other than Michael, all of us are economists, and we have Sandra Rosa, who's also going to be a discussant, who joined the Development Research Group about 4 years ago. She was a professor at USC, tenured there, and decided to join us. We're very privileged to have her. Both of them have done amazing work on this subject, so very glad to have them as discussants. So this is a product of CFAR, and we are very glad to present it to you. The way we're going to break it down is Hazel is going to start for about 15 minutes. Prerna will follow for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have space for the discussants. I want to mention that this paper is a joint effort between scholars from different disciplines, as I pointed out. There's Victoria S.S. from the Department of Psychology at the University of Western Ontario, Alison Herrell, who's a political scientist at the University de Quebec à Montreal, Matt Lowe, who's in the economics department at UBC, Aaron Mills, who's the faculty of law at McGill, Manasi Rao, was one of the research assistants for projects, who's in the Department of Political Science at Yale, and Stephen Riker, who's at the School of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of St. Andrews, and the three of us. So that's really where this paper's coming from. Hazel.
Okay, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks, Bijou, for the introduction. Let me start with the obvious, which is that intergroup hate is spreading worldwide. We can see it as hate speech is becoming normalized. Hate groups are proliferating. Opponents across domains are routinely framing their opponents as evil, implying that vanquishing them is the moral and the good thing to do. So this is where we start. Now, when we're talking about in-group hate, we have a specific definition in mind. We don't mean, as many people often think, that it's just a hot emotion inside individual hearts and minds. It may be that, but our point today is that it's also a community and a collective and an institutional product. It's human-made. It's human-fueled, and it's human-mobilized, and it's manifest in our individual beliefs, attitudes, and actions, but also in our collective beliefs and actions and our norms, in our systems, policies, and laws that together can hurt others based on their group membership. So our particular definition of intergroup hatred is this one: animosity and mistreatment or endorsement of the mistreatment of members of other groups that is seen as justified, necessary, and good. So I'll say some more about that as we go on. Now, our overall project goals, as you will see, are multiple and lofty, but that's where we're starting. We're a big group, so we think we can do a lot. First of all, we want to synthesize the many and substantial insights from across our disciplines, from economics, from social psychology, from political science, from sociology, from anthropology, from the law, from so much work in development. And we want to synthesize this, then we want to draw out the policy implications of this synthesis to try to understand and begin to address those factors that are generating and sustaining hate. We think we have enough knowledge across the disciplines to pull it together now. So what I want to do next here is introduce the 10 reason cycle of hate. And our thought there is that we can show with these 10 reasons how the cycle escalates and how it keeps a cycle of hate going. And we want to suggest that since hate is human-made, human-fueled, and human-mobilized, hate by humans together may be disrupted, diffused, and mitigated through coordinated human efforts, particularly through economic and institutional and social interventions that we know a lot about in our different disciplines. And so our ultimate goal here is some type of early warning systems to detect and counter the production of hate before it's mobilized and justified. So let me start with the 10 reasons, cycle of hate right now. Here, I want to emphasize first is that we understand hate as a product, but also very importantly, as an ongoing set of processes, continually creating an us and a them. And this process involves individuals, it involves communities, it involves institutions. And we want to assert with this figure that there are 10 strong reasons why members of one group hate members of another group. Now, I also want to say that these reasons can be found across historical and cultural contexts, although of course they're going to take somewhat different forms in particular historical and cultural contexts. We've arranged these reasons into 4 conceptually and empirically grounded components, and those are the 4 big boxes here. History at the top, over on the my right, current context, then at the bottom here, call to arms, and then the 4th one, justification of mistreatment. And each of them contains a set of interrelated reasons that bolster that component. 2 things, notice the double-headed arrows here. We want to imply that hate can begin at any stage in the cycle, and it also can move in either direction. So we have to take that into account. Okay, so we have this figure. We also have a artist's rendering of the cycle of hate, and this is an infographic that depicts the 4 components, and it has icons for each component that to sort of help you remember what's in each component. So our thinking has been here that just as meteorologists can build early warning systems to detect hurricanes before they make landfall, we could, working together, build early warning systems to detect hate before it erupts into mistreatment and justification of hate, and then finally violence. We already know a lot of the warning signs in our various fields. We know we can see the temperature of the rhetoric rises. We see that happens. We know that we can see surges of dehumanizing language. That's very much obvious. We can read and hear the storm clouds of us versus them gathering on the horizon. We can see them. Like weather scientists then, I think we can imagine ourselves in that position and think that social scientists and policy makers together should be able to track these signals. We could model their likely paths. We could issue alerts that could help various communities begin to think about it, prepare, maybe think about how to respond. The point being here, don't want to take the analogy too far, but hate, like a hurricane, doesn't appear out of nowhere. It doesn't just erupt from people's hot, angry emotions and then they just, all of a sudden began mistreating others. It really builds, hate does, in fairly systematic ways over time, and with the right kind of questions and the right kind of data, widely trusted messengers, and response plans that are geared to local knowledge and cultural context, we could see hate coming and act before it becomes a Cat 5. So that's, the overall big idea of what we're thinking, why we want to do this. So I'm going to use this infographic to indicate each of the 4 components. I'm going to go through quickly and just give you a sense of those reasons. So let me start first with history. History includes group history, and this is history that's passed on in schools. It's in our legal institutions, in laws and policies. It's in textbooks. It's in novels, and of course in our personal and family histories as well. History is always hugely, hugely important in understanding hate. It has a great potential to create and reinforce hate. Yet if you look through our academic analyses of hate and conflict, it's often ignored. The same is true in development efforts. The same is true in many of our ongoing intervention. Group history usually takes into account our perceptions of our own groups and the groups they've interacted with in the past. So here, for example, are 2 infamous groups. Most people now see these 2 groups as hated out groups. Some may still see them as in groups. But how people have been socialized with respect to these groups, and it provides a set of narratives, images, schemas through which we make sense of what's happening right now in our environment. So the point is, history, it's past, although it always matters in our analysis, and we have to think about that. Just as one simple example, regions with anti-Semitic pogroms in the 14th century in Germany are still the regions today in Germany, 600 years later, where you will see the most anti-Semitic violence and Nazi support. Okay, so now the second aspect of the component of history is personal family history. So without saying too much, it's kind of obvious that's what's passed on in our families from our collective histories. It really matters. Arguments at the dinner table, like we're depicting here, are more than just arguments. They are arguments, but they pass on who's us and who's them, who we should include and who we should exclude. And we need to pay attention to this. Now, these 2 aspects of the component of history are important in propelling the cycle of hate, but it's our current context, which is the next big component, that gives them real meaning and direction. So this second component brings together 4 interrelated and really powerful reasons that can further generate and fuel hate: identities and norms, feelings of competition and loss, threat, and lack of control and uncertainty. So starting at the top with reason number 3 there, identity and norms. Our group identities derive from our collective and also our personal histories we just mentioned. Most of us have a variety of identities that come from our countries of origin, our gender, our ethnicity, our race, our occupations, our political affiliations. In the current context, our identities are very critical. I think social psychologists pay a lot of attention to this. They tell us who we are, what's good, what's bad, what has meaning and importance. They motivate us. They provide explicit and implicit norms about how we should think, feel, and act. So they have a lot of powerful positive functions. They also are, of course, the site of many of our stereotypes and biases that we carry for other groups. So here, for example, in this image, we see that our identities can be chosen by the group, as an example of the KKK there, or they can be imposed on your group by the outgroup, as we see in this sign from the Jim Crow South. But these group identities, whether chosen or imposed, and we have to negotiate both of those as individuals and groups, they're central to our attitudes and our treatment of other groups. They define the groups that we value and respect, as well as those groups that we can rightly ignore and mistreat. Abundant research demonstrates that protecting our in-group identities can, sometimes it's inadvertent, sometimes not, it can lead to norms of mistreatment of those that are seen to threaten our important identities. So in this image, for example, hate's on display in this image of the KKK marching in a show of force against what they perceive as lesser in-groups, which, as you see in this, which they see in the sign as black people, Mexicans, and dogs. People in the Klan and many in the South felt that the defeat of the Confederacy was a deep humiliation. The KKK was an important identity for those who perceived freedom for formerly enslaved people, and eventual black advancement would only come at their own expense. And so what we're seeing here is that this was an example of competition and loss fueling hate. And what white farmers in the South were experiencing at that time was the loss of coerced free labor. And they were also, very importantly, losing the world as they knew it. The perceived natural order was under threat. And which brings us to this really most important reason in the current context, which is competition and loss. And then connected with competition and loss is threat. And threat to one's in-group identity and the sense of you and your way of life being displaced or replaced are central to in-group hate. Threats constrict the psyche, they limit the span of attention, and when the threat to your identity hangs in the air, we can find these kinds of narratives, and we can find them throughout history and across the globe. They're invading our country, they're taking our jobs, we're at a breaking point, go back where you came from. These people are making our cities unsafe. Competition, sense of loss, threat are completely intertwined, and they can lead to feelings of control and feelings of a lack of control and uncertainty. And when this happens, this is a really big warning sign. These together, things are highly combustible. The sense of a lack of control and uncertainty tightens the in-group identity and activates this idea that you've got to restore certainty and control. And then what you see is these ideas of dominating another group or excluding them, or even the extermination of them. So you can see in this office, we see a group responding to the ideas of economic uncertainty and rising job loss. Now, understanding what's going on here, a complex economic situation is challenging at best. But when people are experiencing a lack of control, they're in no mood for a complex analysis, and what you see is that they're very vulnerable to seeing the world in terms of us versus them. So it's at this exact point when heightened group identity, competition and loss, threat, and a lack of control come together that we should be on the highest alert for the next component of the cycle of hate, which is a call to arms, which often works to mobilize and to these feelings of threat, anxiety, vulnerability, and to suggest that people take up arms, particularly dangerous component. And how this call to arms component works depends on two big reasons here: leadership and media, two areas where we feel there has not been enough research at all. They're particularly significant in mobilizing hate. They promote narratives of events that can engage people, also enrage people, so that the cycle of hate is really fueled and propelled faster. Here is a slide of Enoch Powell. This is just one example of leadership. Enoch Powell was an MP in the British Parliament in the 1970s and 80s. He warned that mass immigration to Britain would lead to rivers of blood. And in a famous speech he wrote, "As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood." Many argued that this speech, the way he used history, and the moral conviction with which it was delivered from a highly educated government leader, longtime government leader, gave a certificate of respectability to white racist views. So leaders who mobilize threat and hostility among in-group members have a huge role in the cycle of hate. They can cause significant harm, particularly, and they can increase societal polarization. Okay, the next powerful factor in the call to arms is, of course, media. And what you see here, media is our window to the world, shaping our understanding of everything which we don't have direct experience with. Media coverage influences our public perception. It can incite hostility between groups. And with the expansion of social media, the opportunity for through AI to manufacture reality, just actually what you're seeing as true and real, only expands. Here we see a group of people reacting to the breaking news, and if this news includes a call to arms and a vision of impending violence, it becomes its own powerful institutional force to further fuel and mobilize hate. So the fourth and final component of the cycle is the justification of hate. And here we see in the graphic two people from different and opposing groups, both looking smug, self-satisfied, heads held high, convinced they are right in their animosity and treatment of the outgroup. And because others, as we're trying to indicate here, are thought to be no better than cockroaches and rats. So we've defined intergroup hostility, as you remember, as animosity and mistreatment, or the endorsement of mistreatment of members of other groups that is seen as justified, necessary, and good. Now we need to define what it means justified, necessary, and good, and this is captured by these final two reasons, moralization and dehumanization. Moralization is a way of saying these people aren't like us. They don't share our values and our way of life, so we hate them because we are right in our beliefs. They don't deserve our empathy. In other words, this justification of others often begins with moralization, which results when your group claims the moral high ground here. The second factor of mistreatment and the justification of mistreatment, and the factor that often accompanies moralization, is dehumanization. So this occurs when groups question the value of the other humans. When people start to question the value of other humans, then once they do this, they can begin to dehumanize these other groups and denote them as less than human. Across history, they've been denoted as parasites, monkeys, rats, swarms, flocks, and cockroaches. This is a poster from the Rwandan genocide. During the time, the Hutu referred to the Tutsi as inyenzi, which means cockroaches, and you can see it here. And the sign says that these cockroaches should be drowned in the river. So we see a moral distancing of the outgroup and a fostering of the sense that there's no need for empathy. Mistreatment of these groups based on their membership is justified, and violence is almost as night follows day will ensue. So that's been my very quick spin through the four components and the 10 reasons in the cycle of hate. My goal has been to expand our notion of hate and to see it as human-made, human-fueled, and human-mobilized and justified, and to suggest that it should be possible to begin developing a set of early warning systems. So now I'm going to turn over to Prerna Singh, and she's going to talk about the possibility of breaking the cycle. This one. Great.
Thank you, Hazel. I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so giving you a sense of some of the most exciting research that suggests possibilities for how to break this cycle that Hazel has so nicely laid out for us. And so there is no beginning to the cycle, but as you can see right here, beginning at the top box, which is, of course, about how historical narratives shape and are reshaped and how they pass down hate. One way in which historical narratives can be reshaped at the level of group history is, of course, through collective remembrance. And so this can happen, for instance, through movies and many other ways. So there is a lot of research around the 1915 movie, which was The Birth of a Nation, which, returning to Hazel's point about the Confederacy, really kind of revived this idea that the Confederate had a lost cause, and has been shown to be really important in fueling this narrative. By the same logic, you can also have interventions that actively promote more inclusive historical narratives in popular culture. And there is evidence to show the positive effect of this. We have here on the right a picture of what are called Stolpersteine in Germany, which I actually encountered when I spent a year in sabbatical, which are literally stumbling stones, plaques on ordinary cobbled roads that mark the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. And there's evidence to show that the placement of these new stones through regression discontinuity designs have a small but significant decrease in vote for far-right parties in Germany. Monuments and street names is another way in which we can intervene in breaking these historical narratives. Relatively little research on that. But in terms of museums, a study here, for instance, to the Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Chile, showed that there was increased support for democratic institutions and restorative justice policies after a visit to this museum, regardless of prior ideological beliefs. So, building on this logic of commemoration and taking it further, countries have also experimented with much more direct confrontations with their recent histories of hate in the form of truth and reconciliation commissions that bring the victims and perpetrators of hateful episodes together. And again, there is evidence that this allows people in countries, for instance, South Africa, to rebuild social capital. But there's a big but. Whose history? We are seeing this really today. What is history? Which group's history is an open and controversial question. A lot of these studies have mixed results. So, for instance, a visit to the Holocaust Museum in Berlin actually increased civic knowledge, but it decreased religious tolerance. And in the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, it does rebuild social capital, but often at a relatively high psychological cost to the victims who are exposed to their own and others' past trauma. And not to mention that there's actually a pretty massive political divide in the utility of actually looking to the past to understand the ways in which we might break the cycle. So, another important site in which historical narratives are perpetuated, especially across generations, is in the family. A lot of evidence that parents' attitudes transfer to children. And here again, we can intervene a study by Dimas et al. That shows that reminding people in Europe, particularly here in Greece and Germany, of their own families' histories of forced relocation reduces opposition to present-day immigration. Another key site, of course, for the forging of these historical narratives, as Hazel mentioned, are schools. And this is an important and fertile site of research. So on the one hand, just the presence of schooling, irrespective of content, has the potential to reduce hate. Charlotte Cavaillé and co-authors show that just an additional year of schooling reduces opposition to immigrants in Europe. The construction of primary schools in Indonesia reduces violent conflict. And then the format of how classrooms are structured. So, for instance, classrooms that encourage open discussions have been shown to be more effective at reducing hate. And finally, of course, that schools purposefully and systematically instill a set of values, a role, of course, that has put them at the center of policy debates historically and, of course, today. And so, as just one example of many studies, how school curricula Lee 2023 shows how a Taiwanese curriculum reform that began to emphasize a much more exclusive historical narrative in order to promote this kind of common Taiwanese identity actually prompted more exclusionary attitudes towards immigrants. So all of these, of course, interact and take place within the current context. And so following what Hazel laid out, interventions in the current context, and a very important side of intervention, has been how a common in-group identity can break the cycle of hate. And the logic here is that essentially bringing people together within a shared superordinate identity can allow the breaking of a cycle. And the evidence for this model has really accrued over many decades. Curtis and co-authors show that increased identification less with your own specific European country, but with the idea of Europe, reduces anti-immigrant attitudes. Yoruba adults in Nigeria who are primed with a shared Nigerian identity have more positive attitudes towards members of other tribes, such as Idos and Igbos. And this holds even for groups previously in conflict. American and Israeli Jewish people and Palestinian Muslims, when reminded of a shared Abrahamic identity, Serbs and Bosniaks in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we have here a study that I did with 2 then graduate students at Harvard that showed that promoting a shared Indian national identity in survey experiments made the dominant ethnic group Hindus more pro-social towards Muslims. Real-world policies within the common in-group identity models have focused on, for instance, sports and the way that sports can inculcate a shared identity as a site for inclusive nation building. And here we have a poster from the movie Invictus, which really evokes the way in which Nelson Mandela systematically, deliberately, and quite effectively used South Africa's hosting of the Rugby World Cup to unite Black and white South Africans in the wake of apartheid. Sporting victories have been shown to reduce ethnic salience and promote inter-ethnic trust among co-nationals, but of course, again, this comes with a big but, which is that all groups, particularly nations, are unequal. There's a certain prototypical idea of what an Indian or an American looks like. And so in promoting these shared identities, in some ways you might reinforce these status hierarchies and ideas of prototypicality. And the question also of how long does the effect of hosting a sporting event or a sporting victory last? Another way in which interventions within the current context and within identity can break the cycle of hate is through structured intergroup contact. And these are a set of rigorously done high-quality studies that show the positive effects of intergroup contact. And it goes back really to really foundational work by Allport and others. Now, important to keep in mind that there are always certain conditions under which intergroup contact is likely to be more beneficial. For instance, equal status, shared goals, intergroup cooperation, and social norms and institutional support. And again, just to give you a flavor of what is quite a rich scholarship, work here again within sporting teams. So bringing people together to play on football teams in post-ISIS Iraq, in cricket teams in Sri Lanka. And one of our co-authors, Matt Lowes, an economist at UBC, has shown how mixed caste cricket leagues in India has large positive effects on willingness to play with out-group members, people of other castes, and also has effects on cross-caste friendships and cross-caste trade. But there's always the but. Matt himself, in a meta-analysis of 41 of these experiments, shows that these intergroup contact studies have small effects. There are concerns about external validity. When you go off the field, does it last? How long does it last? But also quite dangerously mixed results. So Skako and others in Nigeria actually show backlash to potential intergroup contact. And finally, an important nuance that I think in some ways reflects the effectiveness of how this project has come to be is that extended contact. You know, Biju mentioned that we've been working together for many years, is likely to be more effective than these one-off short-term interventions. So another site is, of course, regular, routinized, ritualized contact, which goes back to Emile Durkheim's idea of ritual. And here we have evidence on the effect of pilgrimages, of collective gatherings, of youth camps, and also notably, and here on the right, we have an orchestra that was founded by Daniel Barenboim and the late Palestinian scholar Edward Said in 1999 that deliberately brought together people, the East-Western Divan Orchestra, from different communities, Jews, Arabs, to promote coexistence and intercultural dialogue. And this is now in its 25th year. So a different strategy within the current context to break the cycle of hate is to, quite distinct from, in a way, intergroup contact, is to be able to promote economic cooperation and interdependence. And this is an idea that goes back to classical theorists, Montesquieu and Adam Smith as well, the idea that commerce produces peace. And there's some evidence for this in terms of how in the post-Second World War era, international trade is what has been at least partly responsible for the reduction in interstate war. And that same logic that financial markets offer another route to common economic interests, Somja and others showed how participation, interventions to randomly allocate people to participate in the stock market in Israel, and stocks are pegged to both Israel and the Palestinian Authority, reduces the probability of voting for parties that are against peace negotiations between Jews and the Palestinians, between Israelis and Palestinians. But, and there is the but, this can also have the opposite effect because economic development, even when they are net positive, can lead to a sense of competition and loss and threat between people. And we have evidence from Uganda to Jordan to Afghanistan to Bangladesh to Sweden that hosting or helping refugees, even when it leads to overall economic growth, can lead to this perception of a sense of loss and competition and foster backlash against immigrants. So these cases suggest that any policy focused on reducing hate by relying on economic cooperation must be accompanied by attention to threat. And threat, of course, is not just realistic in terms of threats to life security and resources, but also critically, often more importantly, it is symbolic. And symbolic threat in terms of threats to identity, ideology, and values is often a greater predictor of intergroup hate. So related to this idea of threat is a loss of control of powerlessness. And one way in which people have been shown to respond to threat is to try to regain a sense of a sense of control. And this one way to do that is by strengthening group identity. And strengthening group identity, feeling a sense of control, can boost well-being. And our co-author Alison Harrell, who's a political psychologist, and her co-authors have shown how this increased sense of control at an individual level, you feel you're more in control of your circumstances, of your situation, actually reduces hostility towards immigrants. But, there's the but, strengthening group identity can lead to an embrace of extreme actions. It can be accompanied by conspiracy theories and narratives of victimhood. And so just to bring it together, as Hazel mentioned, competition, threat, a sense of control, a loss of control, all reflect and promote each other. So on the one hand, you have interventions such as anti-poverty interventions or globalization, and the beneficiaries of these interventions perceive a reduction in their sense of threat and intergroup competition. They feel a greater sense of control, and that can potentially reduce hate. But on the other hand, perceived losers feel a heightened sense of threat, intergroup competition. They feel a loss of control, and that can increase hate. And so the two cycles can go simultaneously. So, as Hazel mentioned, this idea of a call to arms is actually a relatively underdeveloped site of research and is calling out for more important work. Within leadership, our colleague in the University in St. Andrews in Scotland, Stephen Riker, has shown that leadership can promote hate in at least 4 distinct ways. Leaders can portray outside threats and say that they're not protecting in-group interests. They can accuse their rivals of not protecting the in-group. They can demand unity to demobilize potential movements against their authority. And they can establish and enforce group norms, values, and goals to create a sense of unity among in-group members through a shared opposition to an outgroup. Again, by that same logic, if leaders can create and foster hate, they can also be important nodes of interventions to break that cycle. So we have a picture here of Justin Trudeau shortly after he was elected to power in Canada in 2015. He promised to bring 25,000 Syrian refugees. The language to describe this intervention was uniformly positive, and he went so far as to go to the airport to greet plane loads of Syrian refugees to welcome them to Canada. And our colleague at the University of Western Ontario, Vicky Esses, and co-authors have shown that this pro-immigrant position on the part of an important leader in power, Trudeau, Prime Minister, they leveraged longitudinal data to show that it actually promoted a more positive view of refugees in Canada. Related to leadership, of course, the role of leaders, their rhetoric is amplified by the media, which, as Hazel mentioned, is really our window to shaping how we understand the world. They distribute messages of leaders, they construct narratives, and the ways in which media frame events can fuel polarization and hate. And we know that actually anti-polarization messages are out there in the ecosystem, but that social media algorithms can prevent them from spreading. But the way in which media can be an important node to break the cycle of hate, this is again a really important and robust field. The ways in that they can reduce intergroup hate, we have evidence from looking at programs such as Sesame Street, radio shows like Superman, scholarly research that has shown how these promoted intergroup tolerance. But in terms of interventions across the world, Rwanda, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, in Rwanda, radio was a really important tool of spreading hatred. Hazel mentioned that. And so just as much as it was a powerful tool of spreading hate during the genocide in the 1990s, it has been leveraged in experiments to show how it can positively influence norms. work by Betsy Paluck, a soap opera with intergroup-related messaging promoted more positive norms, such as support for intergroup marriage. In Bangladesh, a documentary film about an ethnic minority, Santals, when it was shown to the ethnic majority Bengalis, actually increased pro-sociality towards this ethnic minority. And news podcasts, experiments using news podcasts in India and Pakistan, show that correcting rumors reduce support for vigilantism, which is an important problem, particularly in India today. So as Hazel mentioned, one way in which people justify their call to arms is through this justification of mistreatment, moralization, and dehumanization. We are doing the right things because our enemies, the outgroup, are less than human. And a substantial body of research, again, that has shown how framing this as a defense of moral values as the right thing to do can increase violence and extreme behavior. But here I just want to say, particularly referring to, I think, the really foundational work of our discussant, Sandra Rozzo, and others, that the non-judgmental exchange of perspectives can actually reduce this tendency towards moralization and dehumanization. So Professor Rozzo has, for instance, shown in experiments in Colombia that exposing people to video games, to documentary films about Venezuelan migrants reduces anti-immigrant attitudes. And it has also been shown within the United States. Immigrants are often described in less than human terms. This erodes the moral and emotional barriers to mistreatment, makes it much easier for you to think that you're doing the right thing. It's the morally right thing to do. And again, paralleling Professor Rozzo's work, we have evidence that shows that, for instance, virtual reality games. You put people in a virtual reality experience in which they're crossing the US-Mexico border in the south. They are experiencing crossing the border, being apprehended by a border control agent. In addition, in combination with providing them information about immigrant, really leads to a significant increase in empathy and promotes attitudes that are much more positive towards immigrants, that experience of literally being in their shoes. Other experiments and studies that have shown that, again, schools, we return to schools here. Remember, we had talked about schools in kind of sites for remolding historical narratives. We return here to how schools can train children into kind of really being able to see the perspective of others. And empathy interventions have been shown to reduce peer violence in Turkey. And empathy education reduces prejudice against Syrian refugees in Jordan. And just before I turn it over to Biju, to say that this is exciting research, it's important research, but it has really been disconnected and siloed across disciplines. And it has taken an interdisciplinary team working over a pretty extended period of time to try to coalesce this research together. And of course, there are caveats and much more needs to be done, but our hope is that this comprehensive multidisciplinary review can form the basis on the one hand for scalable policy interventions, but also to point to avenues for future scholarly research. And of course, the two go together. Over to you, Biju.
You have the clicker. So, as Prerna said, our goal here is to sort of synthesize results across disciplines, bring them together, and then draw from that some generalized findings. Yeah, it was a difficult exercise. We're still not done. But as we read the literature, we not only learn from each other, we also learned what is missing in that literature. There's a huge amount of research still to be done, as always, but in this case particularly. But what we're trying to do here, as Hazel mentioned right at the beginning, and has huge implications for the bank, is to identify an early warning system. When we're doing our policy work, when we're designing policies, what is it that we have to look for when we're designing those policies so we don't fuel hate? Yeah? And in fact, when we look at the research on Rwanda, the Rwanda genocide, Peter Rubin's book published in 1999, I think, documents systematically how development interventions favored the Tutsis and therefore fueled resentment against them from the Hutus. Our interventions. And I can assure you, and all of us know this continues. It's not gone away. The bank does not care about this stuff as much as it should. It used to. After the Rwanda genocide, there was a period of about 10 years when it cared a great deal. It's gone away. Yeah? And if we don't care, and we think growth will do, and jobs will do everything good for everybody else, we might end up in that same cycle, in the same mistakes that we made 20, 25 years ago. Okay? So we have to understand how the interventions are going to work through intergroup dynamics in that country. And some of these are very complex countries, as we know. Yeah? So how can we address this? And we have to be alert to intergroup, between group inequality, and we know that can make the cycle of hate worse. Particularly when we're thinking about the gains to growth and the gains to jobs and so on and so forth. How does it, we know that getting a job improves your identity, improves your sense of well-being, enhances your aspirations. It does a whole bunch of good things, reduces loss and threat. But the uneven access to those jobs can be hellish for fueling conflict, which is then going to have a negative impact on growth a few years down the line. Why can't we forget? Why do we forget that? Yeah? The diminishing in this institution of the attention to social and cultural and political factors in designing policy is horrendous. In my 26 years here, I've seen a decline of that. We were hired, Michael and I, by James Wolfenson himself to bring these ideas into research. It's been forgotten about, more or less. Yeah? This has to come back. Otherwise, we'll be making the same mistakes again. I'll be leaving the bank in 2 months, so I'm going to say that now. Now, access to jobs, access to growth should be evenly, as much as possible for us to do with design, evenly accessed across groups. Then, building interdependence across groups. So, there's now, I think, we barely mentioned the papers, there are plenty of papers on this. Building economic interdependence across groups increases and improves their ability to get along, which makes sort of sense. When you're working towards a common purpose, you're going to get along. Building it, Michael and I have both done work on this, building institutions for deliberation, for cross-group communication, to work on public goods together, to work on public access, public services together, can also build commonalities and reduce hate. Collaboration on these issues can reduce conflict. But to do this right, you have to pay attention to history and social structures in designing these community-led interventions, which again the bank failed to do early on. Now it's getting much better. You cannot just pluck something off from Indonesia, throw it into the Congo and expect it to work. It has to be done in the context of that country and with attention over time to learning by doing, to make it fit the context, yeah? Before we scale it up. So, very quick intervention to say, this stuff should be central to how we at the bank do our work, and I hope we bring it back and take it seriously. Otherwise, we're going to feed into that cycle without even knowing it. Okay? Thank you. I'm going to stop there and invite Sandra to make her comments. Find your... I'll help you.
I think I see it here. Switch. Yeah? I have it here. Oh. Yeah, it was that one. Super. Well, thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be here. So I really want to thank Viju and co-authors for the invitation to talk about this very important topic. So I have to confess that when I was invited to read your slides, and at the end I stopped reading and I had two thoughts. And the first one was, wow, this is very refreshing and very different and very innovative, ambitious to what I have been kind of reading traditionally. And it puts the finger into a problem that we all are facing as humanity every day, something we are very familiar with, but we tend to kind of ignore. And so I really kind of congratulate you on taking this challenge, as I know it's not easy. The one thing that I was very impressed about is that you're putting together a very fragmented literature in which you are combining political science, psychology, economy, which is something that we're really bad at doing, especially myself. I'm a sinner in in this type of practice where we actually think we're inventing the wheel every time we talk, and then we kind of realize that when we actually think together collectively, and this is something you have been kind of pushing very hard in our group, Biju, we can come up with this type of frameworks that are very comprehensive and actually allow us to understand the complexity of reality. So congratulations, it's an honor to read this and to give you my thoughts. That was my second thought. Thank you so much for the invitation. So the first, so the suggestions that I will give you are my attempt to think outside of the box in a very complex topic. And so, of course, feel free to ignore what you don't think is relevant. And if you think there are others that are kind of valid for what you're doing, fantastic. Then I did my homework well. So the first point is on social media, which I think might be the big difference from what we have seen historically. So how I interpret social media is sort of a creator of parallel realities where our biases are kind of validated and we kind of are able to live in a world where everyone thinks like you and you don't really come across the thoughts or you don't really have to discuss with opponents. And that actually amplifies polarization. And so I think this is something that in your project, if you're going to write a book or a series of papers, needs to come front and center. I think this is very much what changes today. And I think this magnifies your circle and makes it more quick, this kind of cycle that you're talking about. So I would say this is something to talk about. And then I actually started thinking about how can we kind of make, or you in your team, how can you make this more salient so that practitioners, not only the World Bank, but generally people that are working in development policy kind of think, oh, this is central to what I am doing. And so it's very much on the ideas that you were kind of sharing earlier, Viju. I think that when we're talking about economic equality or when we're designing social protection programs or inclusive growth, we're actually tackling the causes of this problem. But you actually have to tell that to policymakers so that they realize what this is actually doing. The same with community-driven development programs or participatory institutions. And we're doing all of these things in the bank, and we're doing this as development practitioners all over the world. Not only the World Bank, but many other practitioners are doing it, and this is also kind of building social cohesion. But it's important for them to kind of trick in their brains that this is what they are doing with their actions as well. And this is so important for humanity, because if we're going to survive as a human race, we actually need to reduce our polarization. And also something that you mentioned that I think is very central is to, whenever we think about programs, try to design them with sensitivity to kind of prevent more conflicts. And I think this is crucial. For example, in the field where I work, which is refugee policy, we have to be very cautious as not to create programs that exclude certain groups, because that actually we have seen across the board amplifies resentment from different groups, either the refugees or the hosts. They feel like threatened because there is a program where they don't. Why am I am also a human? Why I am paying taxes too? Why, etc. And so, in the sense that we try to be inclusive, we're kind of preventing all of that. And then I also thought about, okay, this is such an ambitious program. So I was trying to think outside the box, and I thought, okay, how would they actually build these early warning indicators in practice, right? So could it be something like a global public good? It doesn't have to come from the bank, but it could come from CFAR, where you actually sit down and make a map, and with big data try to take social media data and measure hate in these 10 dimensions and kind of say, okay, this is an early warning indicator. We see that when this indicator actually passes 10, there is a civil conflict. And that would be an incredible contribution, because then we stop from being kind of reactive to being preventive. And if you are able to do that, well, you have clicked many boxes, because that would be a public good for humanity as well. Because at the end, we know that when conflicts begin, they tend to last many years. They are very difficult to stop. So if we just were able to prevent conflicts more efficiently, well, then we can all retire now too. And then 2 more ideas. One, I love your review on the literature on the effective policies. It's just such a rich, successful stories of things that have prevented conflict, increased social cohesion. Could we create something? I'm only thinking about the bank, but imagine you can do it for every practitioner in the world, like a toolkit. And here's like a short dissemination of these are the things that work. And these are the contexts where we have seen this be successful. For example, do contact through sports, do perspective taking, do contact theory. In these conditions, it works. For these countries, this works. School interventions. And so in a way, if I'm a practitioner and I'm working in a country where I see a lot of tensions, okay, how can I couple my intervention with some of these things that might apply because I know that they already worked. But they don't have to invent the wheel. And you kind of summarize this, but just make it very short, very visual, so that it's actually something that is disseminated quickly. And then I guess my last comment, to keep it brief, is on a very challenging matter, which I think you are uniquely placed to answer in this project, which is how do we scale these solutions, right? So all of these solutions correspond to perspective taking in a lab control setting where I'm showing you 20 a video, and then we're done. And I don't know if after the fact, when you keep receiving negative media, you forget. Or we're gonna do contact and we're gonna play sports together, like 100 of us. But the problem is global and we have large scale hate. So how do we scale this thing in a cost-effective way? So I had a project, and this is not a solution at all, but we did it in a lab, online. So maybe online is the solution, but I have never seen a project actually do that. Maybe you're not gonna do that project, but you can actually inspire people to say, okay, look, this is what we're missing right now. We need to figure out how do we leverage social media or low-scale, low-cost interventions to solve this problem. The same with contact. No, we could do scaling contact. We could, but it's very expensive. We could, but nationally, how can we actually convince a government to do this? Politically, it's risky. Like these type of questions are central, and you are uniquely placed to put it in the minds of the right people. So overall, that's it. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I think this is incredible. Congratulations.
Thank you, Sandra, for those wonderful comments and very, very useful. You've given us a lot to think about. Thank you. Michael.
I too want to thank everybody for being here and for the opportunity to just say a few words before we hand it over to everybody else to weigh in on these particular issues. I'm going to take a slightly different approach than I might usually do, because this is an emerging work program and overlaps at certain points with stuff that I'm doing. But I want to start just by suggesting a movie for the audience and for the CFAR group. The next time you gather together as a group, find a Friday night to get a copy of a Ken Loach movie called The Old Oak. The Old Oak. Anybody seen The Old Oak? Watch it this Friday night. Set in the north of England, just outside of Durham, a town struggling because of globalization, and intergenerationally, because the fathers and parents of the current citizens were once proud members of labor unions that worked really hard and protected their industry and their communities and and now you're just seeing the dark side of globalization playing out in this particular community, into which then arrives plane loads of Syrian refugees, right? And the urban anthropology they must have done to capture the conversations that take place in the Old Oak, that's a pub, about how the local people regard these Syrian refugees is very much in the rats and cockroaches kind of space. But you got to hear it to really get how viscerally powerful this all is. And then how it starts to erode even the group itself. Right? They start eating each other like rats do, if you've seen those crazy experiments that they do with rats. They all just eventually become carnivorous amongst themselves. And then, I don't think I'm giving it away, it does actually have a happy ending. But it has happy endings because of, in some sense, or one manifestation of the cycles that I've been talking about in this framework for understanding hate. And I'm going to talk about the two particular dimensions that I think, the ones I'm most interested in. Doesn't mean they're the most important, they're just the ones I have wrestled with for a while. And those are these questions around group history and how history is told and how stories about who we are and who they are evolve, and how scholars engage with that kind of question and yet might have to think somewhat differently when they find themselves confronting rewritten versions of those historical accounts. And also the second one's around this regular, routinized, ritualized contact. And I'll give you two examples, if I've got time, from my own life experience of being in situations where I was a beneficiary of being amongst people who were very well versed in doing their own form of regular, ritualized, and routinized contact and what that looks like when humans collectively have figured out how to do that. It's two of the most magical experiences of my life. So I want to end on that. But the questions that I was coming to with this, and this is a nice work that you would expect serious researchers to do, is to canvas literature, infer from that some meta theory of how things work. I found myself thinking though, what do we know about how bad guys themselves strategize about what they do? Do they have their own version of a PowerPoint slide like that and sort of sit around cooking up the latest ways of making life miserable for the people they hate? But I think that would be really interesting as a source of data. If somehow that you've got I know from going to the Genocide Museum in Cambodia, for example, they were super duper systematic, and we know about the horrors of all of this precisely because they kept such meticulous records of exactly how they tortured someone and exactly how they killed them in the end, and for what spurious reason they came up with for doing that. So I think rather than just relying on our own natural source of ideas and evidence from scholarship and journals and all the rest of it, trying to find a bit more about how systematic organizations against other people are set up, and what even with what's going on in America right now, just what are certain people working not far from where we are right now doing actually systematically to try and ensure that wedge and division sustains itself? What does that look like? And is that, I imagine it's probably going to be pretty consistent with what your own cycle is saying, but I think it'd be really interesting to have that. Secondly, and I guess this is sort of an extension of what I think about a lot when we're trying to deal with issues that are really hard, right? Stopping bad things rather than promoting good things, is if we did actually come up with this beautiful, coherent, compelling, evidence-based understanding of the cycle of hate, what's to stop the bad guys getting hold of that same cycle and going, oh, okay, so that's how it works, right? Now, so they're going to intervene here and here because their model's so great. How are we going to anticipate that so we beat them there and make sure that that doesn't actually work, right? So coming up with a nice plan is all well and good, and it does hopefully help the good guys overwhelm the bad guys. But a really serious model means the bad guys can get access to that too and maybe weaponize it back against you. So how do we deal with that? Well, I think one way we try to do that is through this regular, routinized, ritualized contact, and recognizing, I think, that in the bigger scheme of things, that a lot of the question that several scholars have often posed is, well, why isn't the world even more violent than it is? Right? How is it that humans actually, for the most part, aren't violent towards each other? They get on pretty well most of the time, right? Violence is rare, actually, compared to acts of generosity and kindness that we might encounter in our lives. Why does that happen? Because we're taught to, where we learn how to do that kind of work. And I think we can start to do that kind of work at a much larger scale. And I'll come to that a bit more at the end. But one other way in which I think we do this, one part of the awfulness of what we're living through, whether it's Putin talking about Ukraine or whether it's certain people trying to rewrite the history of January 6, 2021 here in the US, is that whole history is one of the first tasks of the bad guys, for want of a better word, is to rewrite that history, to provide this big justification, right? And now we all recognize when we're writing history of some form that we're doing it from one particular perspective, and we recognize there are histories rather than singular histories and all the rest of it. But in these particular moments, when somebody is explicitly trying to rewrite a story about how the us and them dynamic has been shaped over a particular time period, it's going to require seriously challenging a particular historiography, a particular historical account that's being articulated. And most of us who've done anything historical, and my PhD is in comparative historical sociology, like you bend over backwards to try and accommodate the fact that there are these different voices that are speaking on any particular issue. So it's not hard in some sense to come up with your own internally coherent understanding of how us and them evolved to be the way they are, and be able to just rest on that as your own particular self-justification for why you do things. But how do we challenge historical accounts that we think factually and in the light of a much richer, longer scholarship perhaps, actually warrants trying to challenge very seriously the nature of these particular historical accounts that are being invoked? Because I think the history part is so central to how at least in the big countries that most of us are familiar with, how those stories get told. And a lot of that resting in colonialism and all the rest of it. There's a big way in which the current situation is seen, has to be seen, and justified by atrocities in the past. And how we talk about those seems to me a very, really crucial aspect of it. Another complicating part from a research point of view, I think, as Nicholas Sturks and Jim Scott and other people have done, is showing that the very act of trying to measure and apprehend these and render legible, to use Jim Scott's phrase, these kinds of phenomena itself can become part of the problem. It's a Hawthorne effect in some sense, by the very, or a different kind of effect. The very act of trying to formalize what is often a very fluid set of arrangements can itself be something that gets weaponized. This was partly the story of Rwanda with the Hutus and Tutsis, and one of the first big steps they take was to remove that identity from your driver's license. So it wasn't actionable by anybody. You're a Rwandan. You're not one of these particular groups. But research requires most of the time, not always, obviously, but for big demographic type analysis, that you have very categorical bases into which you put people. Castes in India was Nicholas Sturks' famous case of these. In reality, anthropologically, these were a much more fluid set of boundaries between each of those. But once you have to have a census that has to try and target particular groups with a good intention of trying to focus resources on those particular groups, you make them actionable. You find out where they live. You know how to be able to target these particular groups, not just from the good guys then, from the bad guys as well. And that itself can be a source of great contention there, right? So not just our development projects can be part of the problem, but our own attempts to try and do normal social science can oftentimes itself be unwittingly complicit in being able to render legible something that actually shouldn't be legible in that categorical sense, that must be much more fluid in terms of how all of these particular things interact. So I'm going to conclude with these, if I've got time for these, I'll give you two of these different examples from my own life of engaging with communities that have this baked-in sense of what regular, routinized, ritualized contact looks like. In March of 2019, I found myself in New Zealand. And if you remember what happened in New Zealand in March of 2019, that was the moment when an Australian guy murdered 51 Muslims inside some churches in Christchurch. And my whole schedule there had been planned a long time in advance, so it was entirely serendipitous that my flight and my time there was scheduled to start 6 days after that particular event had taken place. And so I arrived there 6 days later, and knowing full well, and my passport says it, that I'm from Australia. Right? So before I even went, I said, I'm going to have a really different kind of experience. I'm going to love watching a country deal with a big disaster that could so easily get out of control and be weaponized and be used as vindictiveness if they chose it in many different ways, starting with me. Right? If you're a Saudi Arabian coming to the United States 6 days after 9/11, how do you think you're going to be greeted at the airport if you even get on the plane in the first place? Right? So I show up at 6 o'clock in the morning in Auckland, having just flown there with my Australian passport, thinking, okay, what's the immigration official going to do? How's he going to look at me when he sees where I come from? If I was doing most other countries, I'd be probably hauled off for a couple of hours interrogation. Even if it wasn't super hard, it'd just be enough to really allow someone to have some moment of vengeance and pushback against me. So I went up through the customs line. The guy opens the passport and he says, welcome to New Zealand, Michael, and gave me a passport back. And I cried. Wow, how many other countries in the world would let somebody who's just killed a non-trivial percentage of your population and just be totally okay with letting them and actually welcoming you with a genuine smile on their face? The next day I was there happened to be the 1 week anniversary of that massacre occurring. I thought, oh, this will be interesting. How are they going to deal with that? Well, the name of the person who committed all those crimes is never, ever mentioned. That person wants to do this for attention. You don't give it to them. Right? So Jacinda Ardern, the wonderful Prime Minister of New Zealand at that time, set this whole standard of we're not going to give that person what they want. It's all just going to be about how we talk to each other, how we come together to grieve with our Muslim brothers and sisters who've gone through a major atrocity. And so at the exact 1 week moment after that whole massacre had occurred, the nation had a 5-minute window of silence. Everything came to a halt across the entire country. They opened it with an Islamic call to prayer on the equivalent of CBS News, CBS as a channel, right? You imagine that happening on CNN or ABC here in the UK, or the US, of having a Islamic call to prayer be beaconed out across the country? I don't think so. Right? And then I would guesstimate roughly a third of the women, white women, with European-based women of the entire country, without being even prompted with a national plea, all wore hijabs to work that day in solidarity. And I said to people, is anybody sort of bothered about this? Is anybody getting a little pushback against all this? And I was the one then made to look weird. Why wouldn't we want to wear a hijab in that moment in solidarity? Why wouldn't we want to take some moment of silence to prioritize their grieving space and show solidarity? We're all in the same canoe, which was one of their big maxims. So it's just incredible to me to be in a situation where people were able to do that. And how are they able to do that? In part because they've had 150 plus years of a national document, the Treaty of Waitangi, which is periodically updated and revised. And the whole country goes into a process of revisiting their engagements with Maori people, and Maori people in turn with the increasingly diverse population of New Zealanders that they have. All of this a structured practice that goes on routinely all the time. That was their own explanation to me of why they're okay with all of this. They have built into their whole societal structure ways of dealing with difference and a practice of doing all of this collectively that I have never ever encountered anywhere else. And I think in that particular moment, 1 week after a whole massive big drama like that, there is a collective capacity to be able to engage in this non-vindictively and to be able to not see this as the end of their society or as a moment for getting back at people, but for expanding, ever expanding the sense of who us actually is. The last one finally, and I didn't see this in the slides, but as a tool for at least redressing historically some of these sources of hatred and violence, is reparations. I did my PhD at Brown University, so I took it upon myself to read Brown's statement of its own engagements with slavery, because it discovered, inverted commas, relatively recently that a lot of its own buildings and a lot of its money had come from the slave trade, and they were trying to come to terms with this. I thoroughly encourage you to read that document. It's really good, I think, as an honest and thoughtful statement about how an organization of privilege built on upon discovering how much of its eliteness and how much of its stature was a function or made possible by money derived from slavery, and how they proposed to deal with all of that. And I think there's a lot of this. I know there's lots of ambivalence around all of that sort of stuff for normal kinds of reasons, but I think that's the kind of hard conversational work that I think is how these kind of sustained the practices of interacting with hard stuff happens. And another manifestation of that was the conference I went to a few years ago in Canada, in Ottawa, where I found myself around a table of people who were discussing how, having succeeded with a reparations claim of $26 billion to families that had been separated ruthlessly, Indigenous populations that had been ruthlessly separated over the previous 130 years or so. And how are they going to spend this particular money? It's really interesting, right? They've succeeded. Their campaign to get money has won. Great. Oh, geez, now we've actually got to do something. We have to justify how we're going to spend this money. We're going to have to be accountable for it in a certain number of years, because no one's going to give us $26 billion for nothing. We've got to be accountable for all of that. What are we going to do? And just being in a room with people who've been doing a version of CFAR kind of discussions over all the years leading up to this moment. Getting the reparations money took more than a decade of patient, detailed, hard discussions between various different parts of the First Nations of Canada people and the administrations of the different provinces and at the national level, as well as, importantly, social workers and people whose job it is to actually go into a lot of these communities and do the work of trying to aid families and help them to get back on their feet. So we ended up having this amazing discussion for several hours on one particular word. And it was all about the extent to which people suffer as a result of what parental engagement is doing with them, right? And neglect was the big word, right? There's no data on neglect, or if there is, it's going to be the crudest thing possible. What does it mean actually for a parent to be neglectful? When a social worker goes into a community and they see 10 whiskey bottles inside the caravan, is that enough to prove that, well, it was one okay? Right? How are we going to simultaneously give reparations money with one hand and yet have to, on the other hand, potentially take a child out of a family because they are actually being neglected and abused by their current family? Right? How are you going to navigate all of that? Who's going to provide the rigorous evidence on how we've spent our money and what effect it has had on generational levels of trauma that we've suffered as a result of all this? Right? Doesn't mean you can't try and shouldn't do formal research on that sort of stuff, but the relationality was crucial. How you learn to talk to each other in those circumstances in ways that are real, that are compelling, and yet super willing to stand your own ground when you have to, and yet be empathetic towards other people when that's required of you. Those are enormous social skills that this particular community of people had figured out, and I got to be part of it just for 2 days, but it was magic. I've never been in a room where people could have that kind of conversation, not just for half an hour, not just over a beer at a pub, like for hours and hours and hours, where a dean of the School of Social Work in Montreal can stand up and give an impromptu speech for half an hour on help me do my job. Help me do my job. How am I going to train people to give money on one hand and take it away from the other? How are we going to set up an evaluation program for this that's going to be credible? And getting all of this kind of feedback from all these different people and integrating that into a whole different thing. That's the real work, it seems to me, for how we need to move into these things. That's not subvertible, I don't think, at least in my experience, when the big stakes are in place, whether it's a massacre occurring in New Zealand or $26 billion needing to be spent in a year in Canada. When that kind of pressure is put on a system, it halts. And watch the old oak one more time just to see what a community itself can do when they give space to others to be able to enact that kind of skill set in their presence. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Michael, for that very moving discussion, and much to learn from there. We have a few minutes left for questions. Okay, Jed. Yeah, the mic over there, if you don't mind, because the people apparently 60-something people online. So.
Okay. I feel like I should start singing. Okay. Hi, great, thanks. I'll try to be brief, but I'm also trying to express my thoughts in a cohesive manner.
Maybe you can introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, I'm Jed Friedman, long-term colleague of Vijayendra Rao, Michael, and Sandra in the research group. And I love the talk. I love the multidisciplinary nature. So I've learned a lot, all those good things up front. I just want to try to ask a question around really the core aspect of fear and threats and risks to a sense of security, which is at the heart of your presentation, right? And maybe it was generative for what we can call hate, in this case, intergroup hate. Because, I mean, assessing risk in an environment is a fundamental aspect of not just humans. Every living thing has this function, right? And I think that drives it. And at the same time, in our world, defining fear is a politically contested area, right? Should we fear the cultural other in our midst, or should we fear the potential devastation from climate change? And obviously that drives a lot of political decision-making at the individual and group level. And so, obviously reorienting fear away from intergroup conflicts towards real risks, and I say real from my perspective as a social scientist and a humanist and things like that, is sort of a core function, and it's partly what's done by the interventions you mentioned in terms of exposure to others, maybe through random roommate assignments or things like that, or maybe through media. But a lot of those, I was a little depressed because either they're hard to scale, right, like the exposure stuff, or the effects were mild and temporary, right? And so is there anything else, like at a societal level, that we could think of? I mean, one is sort of bearing witness to struggle, right? I mean, that was a success of the civil rights movement, is that ultimately a group through protest repeatedly and suffering broke through the wall. But beyond that, I'm just curious what else we can do to address this core element of how we frame risk and how we understand it in the world. I hope that's clear. Thanks.
Thanks, Jed. Very clear. Yes, sir. Please. And if you could introduce yourself, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
I am Nazir Ahmed from the social impact consulting firm GivingWorks. I think, first of all, thank you very much. This was very, very refreshing and enlightening, and glad to see this kind of thinking at least given some space at the World Bank, which is, again, as all of you noted, quite unusual. I would urge you to turn to another source of insights, which is really in the marketing field. Microsegmentation. I mean, I think there was a book written by an advertising executive called Breaking to Pieces, I believe. Then there was Technopoly. The way in which segmentation for marketing, it came off, with the Regis McKenna called it relationship marketing. It was all about finding the commonalities among small groups of people so you could target everything about them. And combine that with an increase in the surveillance capabilities we have one way or another. And that, I think, provides a huge explosive mixture of capabilities to both divide, conquer, and tell you exactly what you need to hear, and actually in some ways predict some of the responses to that. I'd be happy to write to you and give you some of the citations, but Technopoly is another that Neil Posterman has done about the reliance on technology. But there's a whole body of work that has come in from that work in the corporate marketing sector that may well prove to be useful to you. Thanks.
Mr. Mohammed. We really would appreciate those. My email address is vrao@worldbank.org in case you want to send it to me. Thank you. Maybe I'll ask Hazel, Prerna, and maybe I'll also do a bit of respond both to Sandra and Michael and the comments from the floor.
Is that on? Oh, carry on. Yeah, just to say wow and thank you. Appreciate those comments. They were so rich and so adding to exactly what we have to say if we're going to put this together in some coherent form about how we're going to scale up, what we're going to do, what we are going to do next. My head is spinning about particulars. I think. Yeah, I'm going to watch The Old Oak. I mean, that's so relevant to this the current context part and exactly how to bring that out. I think as Prerna and I are just kibitzing here a little bit, and Bijou mentioned it at the end, the role of more of institutions and of communities and trying to think about the role that they play, both in scaling up the hate, but also in how we're going to break the cycle. I thought the point about, of course, what's happening with social media and the way that these new realities are created for us and we live within them is so dangerous and so problematic. And I live in Silicon Valley, and I'm sort of terrified. I think that's what's fueling a lot of our interest here in this work as well. So we just have to think of what we do there. I think it has to start with education, or education has to be a factor. But of course, we're being blocked from some of that now in lots of ways. People are trying to keep that at least under the radar if they're not changing it. So, yeah, just a set of random reactions, but just mostly to I'm grateful for the comments from both of you.
Yeah, if I'll just chime in, that was really generative, super helpful. You know, Jed, I think your point about fear is absolutely the key thing, and I'm actually surprised that we don't usually use the term. We use threat, or, sense of control, loss, but fear, risk. And I really hear you about the hard to scale, mild, temporary effects. And I think this is where Michael's point about New Zealand, and as a political scientist, I'm really realizing, as Hazel mentioned, that state institutions are kind of missing. And so I think that one way to think about it is that the places that have somehow managed to do it right, or at least as right as we know to be, how have they done it? And I think here Michael's point about, the Dirk Scott genocide ID cards. I have worked with Evan Lieberman at MIT, in which we put together every single census enumeration document across every country beginning at around 1800 to today, and find statistically significant effects no matter what model we run between counting on the census and ethnic category, and then conflict breaking out across exactly that category. And so, it's definitely an argument that I am actually quite sympathetic to, and that gets to this, those are interventions at scale because these are states deciding. And so that tension between, do you, for instance, in India today count caste for redistributive purposes, at least potentially redistributive, and what does that do to caste identities, and does it reify them, as Dirks had shown at a different point in time, and then form the cleavages for future conflict? I think those case studies at a national level, and the fact that New Zealand, which is a place I've been long fascinated by, and within this CFAR group, we've also really been interested in this idea of inclusive nationalism, which in some ways sounds like a paradox or an oxymoron, but how exactly, as Michael described, do you construct this kind of inclusive national identity? So going back to those treaties, going back to their state institutions, their census documents, did they do affirmative action? How did they frame affirmative action so that it didn't give rise to a sense of relative loss or fear or backlash among a dominant group? So I do think that is a really important way, and even looking at places like Brown, where I teach right now, both at reparations documents, but also that they are, of course, sitting on indigenous land today. And so kind of multiple levels of kind of reckoning with where you're sitting and your resources, I think are important ways. And so I think looking beyond what we've looked at marketing, at these instances of institutional, but also state institutions of what works and doesn't work, I think are absolutely critical. Social media is critical. But I think also, Michael, your point about how the bad guys think. It's funny because, I do think trying to see how systematic playbooks of hate have been written, and, returning to Hazel's point, hate is human-made, fueled, mobilized. How this has been done is actually will be a really important point, and we haven't done enough. So really thank you for such thoughtful, generative engagement.
Thanks. I'll just intervene a little bit here. Agree with everything Hazel and Prerna said, and I really appreciate the comments from the discussants and from the floor. One thing about the cycle of hate, everything is a double-edged sword. So one thing about the cycle of hate is, and this is something we should be acutely conscious of, we may have a particular political perspective, and we look at that cycle of hate, we will see it from our eyes. What we hope will happen is that people we may disagree with will see the cycle of hate and see it from their eyes, because they're also feeling hated. Yeah? And that's where the conflict is generated. It happens, it's two sides of a coin. So all interventions that we think about have to be conscious of that fact. It's not just that academics have the right point of view, or folks, who we disagree with politically might have a different point of, had the right point of view. Both point of views work their way through this cycle. Yeah. So what is it that the bank can do? Just to come back to us, there's a lot of, firstly, there's a challenge, and your literature is absolutely right. I think Michael's right about literature, Sandra's right about literature. It's the nature of academic work that we need to get published. And it's the nature of publication in the social science that we have to be causally identified. And it's the nature of causal identification of problems of external validity, and to have very, very small experiments. We are stuck with that, in this world. How do we lift ourselves from there? That's also Jed's point, and start thinking at scale. This is something I've thought about an awful lot, as it happens. And to me, the area that I've thought about, obviously, is local community-led local decentralization types of interventions, which the bank does a lot of still, and is better at scaling up, but not as well as it could be. Doesn't do it as well as could be. But this is where there's a lot of potential to bring groups together. Yeah? Because there's a lot of economic cooperation. I've done some work in India with women's self-help groups where women from different castes come for a joint purpose to sort of get themselves out of poverty, and you find that they forget their identity as different castes. The whole identity reification happens that we are poor women. That's the identity that they fashion, and it's created a huge social movement in India. There are 400 million women who belong to these groups now. Almost every Indian woman in rural India belongs to these, 250 million, not 400, who belong to these groups now. And you find caste getting sort of slowly toned down. At the same time, again, working in India, asking people their subcastes and their jatis has become a thing. Every state government is beginning to do it, forgetting the lessons that we have of what that does. Yeah? And the reason for that is social justice largely. But it's a double-edged sword. So interventions that we design on these things have to be thought of in terms of their scalability, and therefore that as researchers in the bank and otherwise, we have to start thinking, how do we test these things with a view towards scale? Yeah, we've not done that yet because they're hard to publish. So I think that's where the bank needs a research department with different incentives than academic departments. And I hope we come back to that. Thank you. I'm going to stop there, but we are actually out of time. So thanks very much. Thanks for coming, everybody. Thank you. And thanks so much, Ryan and Reena, for helping organize this. They put a lot of work in, and there's still some goodies outside if you'd like to help yourselves. Thank you.